Welcome to the Dean's Forum. I'm Tina Clark. I'm the Director of Formation here at St. John's Cathedral, and I'm delighted once again this week to be given the opportunity to do our interview with Juston Cooper, who is here with us, and I will welcome and introduce him in just a moment and let you know why we hired him. But before we get started, and I want to welcome those of you who are online with us as well. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, let us pray. Look with pity, O Heavenly Father, upon the people in this land who live with injustice, terror, disease, and death as their constant companions. Have mercy upon us. Help us to eliminate our cruelty to these our neighbors. Strengthen those who spend their lives establishing equal protection of the law and equal opportunities for all. And grant that every one of us may enjoy a fair portion of the riches of this land through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Couldn't get much more appropriate than that for our conversation this morning. And that is a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, the prayer for the oppressed. So God bless the prayer book. I want to start. So Juston, thank you so much for being here. Juston Cooper is the deputy director, and we laughed about this because he still makes mistakes too, but of the
Colorado
Colorado
Criminal Justice Reform Coalition.
CCJRC. We're getting it. And Juston, you come to this work from a varied career and have worked pretty much your entire career in community organization, social justice, grassroots, up to the halls of the Capitol building. So You told me that this work isn't just what you do.
Absolutely.
You said, this work isn't just what I do, it's who I am. So just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came. I know you're a native Coloradan.
I am.
We love that.
And thank you, Tina, for having me. I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all this morning. And to your point about the prayer, that resonated. But like Tina said, I'm Juston Cooper. Excuse me, I am the Deputy Director of the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, but I am a Denver native and proud to be one. I make sure I emphasize that in our beautiful and great state of Colorado. But I grew up northeast Denver, during the late 80s and early 90s, and of course, across the country. That was during the era of the crack epidemic, and what we witnessed as citizens and as a society is, this level of harm that was happening to communities. And at the time, the community that I grew up in here in Colorado and Denver was absolutely plagued by that. It was sincerely impacted by that. And so myself, my family were also kind of victims of that era, of those issues. But I say all the time, like you and I talked about, this work is not what I do, it's who I am, because it dates back to my grandmother. I was raised by my grandmother. My grandmother passed away last year, unfortunately, but she lived to be 108 years old. And so she was the oldest woman in Colorado and the third in the nation, and she was born out of Shreveport, Louisiana in 1912. So I literally had the pleasure and the luxury of living with history. And as a child, my grandmother would tell me stories. She would read the Bible to me. She would talk a lot about the things that she experienced through civil rights, through all of those eras and different movements. And that was from the time that I was a kid. And so simultaneous to that, as I was growing up in the area that I was growing up in, we experienced a lot of crime, a lot of violence in our community. And as one of the young people that unfortunately got, somewhat engulfed in some of that climate, I started down that path of trajectory. So I have lived experience in the criminal legal system, as well as professional experience. But I was blessed to have people like my grandmother, people like coaches, mentors, the church, faith, that actually pulled me out of that trajectory. But I knew intrinsically, I knew intuitively that at some point in time I'll be gravitating towards, really carrying the baton and the legacy that my grandmother set. And that landed me in doing this work of social justice reform probably for the last 20 plus years.
Nice. Thank you for that. You mentioned your grandmother's faith and reading the Bible to you, and I I did want to ground us a little bit this morning. It was so perfect that the New Testament reading from the lectionary today, and it's a long one, and I will not read the whole thing to you. If you joined us at 8, or if you join us at 10:30, you can hear the whole thing then. But it's the piece about the body of Christ and how every member of the body matters deeply. And there's a fabulous Liberian folktale that they're reading in Children's Chapel today that goes with it, which is really fun. But part of it says, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and those members of the body that we think less honorable we clothe with greater honor, and our less respectable members are treated with greater respect, whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. So again, so fitting. And where I want to go with that today is that your work is on the ground with people who are impacted on all sides of crime. And your mission, as stated on your website, is to eliminate the overuse of the criminal justice system and advance community health and safety. So you're really looking at both sides.
Absolutely.
So just give us an idea, what does that look like just in a typical workday? What do you do?
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, especially during this climate that we're currently under, right, with COVID. But yeah, on a typical day, our organization, I'd be remiss not to share with the audience, our organization was founded in 1999 by our current executive director and founder, Christy Donner. And at the time in 99, she set out to really look at how to end mass incarceration in the state of Colorado. As we knew, especially during the late 90s or even early 90s, right, not only was Colorado faced with mass incarceration, but the country as a whole was faced with mass incarceration. And so for over 15 plus years, she spent significant time at the Capitol, looking to change policy and reform and really kind of deal with this pandemic of mass incarceration that had metastasized throughout our lifetime. And with that work, our organization was able to close 6 prisons in the state of Colorado. We've passed now approximately over 85 pieces of criminal justice reform legislation. In addition, we've helped support roughly now year to date about $80 million of cost savings in prison budgets and our public safety budget directly deeply into community, right? And so that work had been, work going on for about a decade plus. Well, in 2014, we all came to the table, we meaning our staff, right, and said, look, ending mass incarceration may not happen in our lifetime, unfortunately. But what can we do to scale it out? What can we do to go bigger? What can we do to have much more of an impact? And so we expanded our mission to eliminating the overuse of the criminal legal system and advancing community health and safety. We were very, very intentional about both aspects of that mission. Currently, as we all may know, right, we are over-incarcerating, we're over-criminalizing, right, citizens, people, right, in this country that are dealing with multiple issues and have multiple needs, and we've had this predominant criminal legal system response to the needs of those folks. So the idea was how do we eliminate and reduce this footprint, right, because we're overusing it as a predominant response. The second part of our mission, to advance community health and safety, because we wholeheartedly believe that communities that we all live in literally serve on the safety spectrum. We have a responsibility as citizens and as communities to also provide safety and not just rely on the criminal legal system. And so the idea is advancing community health and safety, very intentional about those words being synonymous. Often when we think about public safety, we have an ongoing theme in our office that we say the average layperson thinks about safety with what we call the 3 C's: cops, courts, and cages. Now there's also first responders like fire, right? But more so, that's the narrative when we think about safety. But when you insert that one word health, public health and safety, then we really think about the vitality of our communities, the health of our communities, and how do we rebuild, and how do we repair, and how do we ensure that our communities are included in that public health and safety spectrum. So we were very intentional about the second part of our mission, excuse me. Therefore, a typical day in our office, we perceived as, I wanted to give that context and backdrop to kind of who I am and who we are as an organization. We're a nonprofit, we're nonpartisan, 501c3, we're a community-based organization in the heart of Denver, and we're perceived as working at the Capitol as a policy organization. So on a day-to-day basis, we are monitoring, engaging, having conversations with multiple stakeholders across the state because we're a state-based organization. And that can look like engaging with people who contact our office and talk about their situation. We're not direct service per se, right? But we help folks navigate. We respond to a lot of folks who are in prison or incarcerated in jail on a daily basis. But we're also interacting with community stakeholders as we continue to look at what's the issues facing Colorado's communities. We also engage with legislators. We engage with state department heads, right? And so, our organization, we really work in tandem with a lot of state agencies in the criminal legal system, but also can be perceived sometimes as on the other side of the fence, right? We challenge the status quo to say, what can we do to do better? So that's kind of our daily bailiwick, our daily operations. However, we're not just a policy organization. We are a community-based organization. So we run several campaigns that are grassroots campaigns right on the ground in the state of Colorado. So it also looks like managing those campaigns daily, right? The efficacy, the sequence of those things, the engagement in community and folks who are involved that these campaigns look to impact. So that's kind of a daily operations of our organization. We're a small staff of 6, so there's not a lot of us, but everyone from our board all the way down through our staff and our volunteers with the organization have been either directly impacted by the criminal legal system, formerly incarcerated in the criminal legal system, or a survivor of crime, right? And so we are who we say, the work that we do, and we're very prideful around that.
Rightly so. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's helpful to get an idea. You guys are obviously very busy.
Yes. Yes. It is drinking from a fire hose.
So you talked to me about people in the criminal legal system, and you make a point of not calling it the criminal justice system,
Correct.
but the criminal legal system. How these people are people who are not a problem, but they have problems. And you used a phrase that they fall into the entrapment of the system.
Yes.
So you talked a little bit, you hit a little bit just on public health, and you mentioned that these people have multiple problems as they're headed into this system. Tell us a little bit, and I think we have a sense, but you surprised me in our conversation with a couple of things about recidivism.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about what are the systemic injustices that put people in the criminal justice system, other than the obvious of you've committed a crime. What's beyond that people tend not to see? And what are the injustices that trap them there once they're in it?
Absolutely. Well, what we come to see is that, society, unfortunately, and fortunately, focuses on human behavior, individuals' behaviors, right? And so, however, the existential crisis that we're dealing with is a systemic issue, right? Not necessarily the individual behavior, right? I wholeheartedly believe, no one's immune to the trials and tribulations of life. People have problems. People are not the problem. So we're dealing with social ills of poverty. We're dealing with social ills of health. We're dealing with social ills of lack of education. All of the kind of basic human needs that we discuss as people all the time, right? That we want that quality of life. But when you have people who are marginalized in that way and not having access to those resources, right, it can conduct some certain behavior. The issue lies in reference to, say, if a person commits a crime. Well, at a core, rudimentary level that we have to consider is when we're over-criminalizing everything becoming a crime, right? You have a systemic criminal legal response to behavior, criminalizing everything. So that initial contact of a person getting into the criminal legal system could be due to substance abuse issues, mental health issues, lack of housing, all of the basic human needs that we know are vitally important for a quality of life. So then they're in the criminal legal system through contact with police, local law enforcement, arrest, et cetera. And that starts the trajectory. And to the latter part of your question, what we find is once people are engulfed in a criminal legal system, how they are trapped there. Well, often they're trapped there because of lack of resources and means, right? A concrete example that I'll share with you is you have someone who is currently homeless, who's ticketed for loitering on multiple times and then arrested. At that point in time that they're arrested, they're charged. And when they're charged, they're detained. Once they are detained, they have the option of being able to bail themselves out of jail, right? Or remain in jail. Well, what we find is that folks who are homeless don't have the resources to bail out. So now you deal with a funding issue, a financial issue that starts that trajectory of that trap. They're too poor to bond out. They don't have those means of resources, so they're sitting. Well, they're sitting often in confinement that doesn't have adequate services for them, especially if they're dealing with mental health or substance abuse issues. And that starts the perpetual cycle, right? They call it the revolving door, when people are going in and out. Excuse me, sorry. So that's one example of how people are often entrapped in the criminal legal system. And then depending on what occurs while they're in there, they can also, pick up additional charges, right? They don't have adequate counsel, they don't have means for counsel, so they're considered indigent. So therefore then they can request a lawyer, a public defense attorney. Well, this is the cycle that happens over a period of time. And while these things are occurring, they're furthermore destabilized because they're not accessing job, right? They're not accessing their education, nor are they accessing any kind of housing because they're in the system. Now, this is an anecdotal example, but when you think about our current system, right, it's not only just incarceration, you also have the surveillance and supervision. So currently right now in the state of Colorado, you have roughly over 23 to 25,000 people incarcerated. That's just in prison. We have 52 county jails. The average daily population of our jails, depending on the size and the county, is roughly usually around anywhere between 1,100 and 1,500 people. So now we're talking about incarcerated in prison, incarcerated in jails, 52 county jails that are ran at the county level. We're not talking about surveillance and supervision. Supervision is roughly around 80,000 people currently under probation, some form of supervision, right? On average, there's around 10,000 people yearly that are coming out of prison on parole. So even though I gave the one anecdotal example of someone who's experiencing homelessness being engulfed, we're talking thousands of people across our state that are entrapped in the criminal legal system. What we often don't know as lay people is that the criminal legal system is not one system. It's multiple moving parts that operate autonomously. So that creates barriers for someone being able to cycle out of the system in a meaningful way, right? And what we find and what we're told, and there's some legitimacy to this, right? But what we find and what we're told is that people are stuck in the system because they commit crime. They pick up new charges, they commit more crime, and that's why we have such an incarceral system where people are entrapped in the prison system. And in our state, it's actually not true. It's called recidivism, when a person recidivates and they go back into the system, and how our state measures recidivism. But it's not tied to new crime. The majority of people that go back to prison in our state or incarcerated in jail actually go back due to what is called technical violations. Technical violations are a condition of their supervision. So there's 3 forms of supervision: parole, when you come out of prison; probation, that you can be convicted and assigned to, right? And pretrial supervision, when you're in jail and you bond out or you're in summons. Well, those types of supervisions come with conditions, things that you have to meet, right, while you're being supervised. An example of that is you have to get employment. An example of a condition of your supervision is you have to have housing. An example is you have to do drug tests, right? And so if a person violates any of those conditions, they can then be revoked. Revoked is sent back to the criminal court proceeding, and then it's determined if they're gonna have to go back to prison or jail. Everything that I just described to you all is not them committing a new crime. It's the basic human needs requirement that if you're in the system and you're dealing with mental health issues and substance abuse issues, how do you get a job? If you have a criminal background, how do you get housing? Right? All of these things, Tina, tend to happen, and when you look at our recidivism rate, it's 54% in our state, primarily technical violations. But it can be portrayed as, oh, people go back because they commit new crimes. So this is the vicious cycle. This is the entrapment. And it's literally due to systemic issues, not the person, because if they were receiving adequate health care, adequate mental health services, adequate resources for jobs and housing, they're meeting the conditions of their supervision.
Yeah.
So then they're no longer at risk of having to be back incarcerated because they have the safety nets and the supports built in. So that's the cycle. That's what tends to occur.
And so just to follow up, so between housing and a job being conditions that they have to meet, doesn't that set up the potential for either landlords or employers, if they know that situation, that the person is on parole, can't that be exploitative?
Absolutely. And that goes back to the scripture that you read about care.
Yeah.
Right? It can be exploited because they can, you have individual landlords that have that discretion, right? And, we witnessed here the moratorium that our state leadership put on evictions, right, during the COVID pandemic, right? But part of that is mitigating predatory landlords, right, that also take advantage of vulnerable people knowing their situation, right? So they're at risk and they're exposed and they're exploited in that way. Similar to the job market, right? Our organization worked on legislation a while back. Many of you may have heard this because it kind of caught fire across the country, called Ban the Box, right? The idea of working with the private sector or government sector, public sector, to eliminate that barrier if you have a criminal record that you cannot get a job. Well, that legislation that we worked on, and it's been worked on across the country, was more for the public sector, not the private sector. So you get employment in the private sector that says, hey, well, you have a criminal record. I'm sorry, we can't hire you, right? But we're also looking at a workforce shortage and crisis. We're also looking at all these kind of paradigms that has a ripple effect, very similar to college, right? On a college application, you have to check the box if you have a criminal conviction. That serves as a barrier to getting into post-secondary education, serves as a barrier to getting student loans. So these are the metastasized barriers that are systemically created, that only policy changes, only law changes in order to reform. This is not the individual we're talking about. We're literally talking about systemic barriers.
Yeah. Thank you. So I want to move on to a couple of your initiatives, of CCJRC's initiatives, specifically. So you told me around 20,000 Colorado children have at least one parent in jail, correct? And in the meantime, financially, budget-wise, we're spending astronomically more per person in jail than we are for K-12 per student for K-12 education or for higher education, which is horrifying. So talk to us about how the overuse of the criminal justice system, criminal legal system, impacts childhood for all of Coloradans, impacts the overall public health of our community, and specifically your community reinvestment program.
Absolutely.
And how that works.
Well, the first thing that we want to consider is separation from the parents and the child, right? If you have a parent that is incarcerated, you just immediately destabilize that home, right? So you have a child that's growing up without one or two parents, or without either, depending on the overcriminalization of people and the incarceration. You destabilize that home. You destabilize their financial capacity to earn. You destabilize their access to basic human needs. So that's the most immediate impact that we see when you have children of incarcerated parents. Along with the psychological, emotional detachment that occurs, right? And so the ripple effect is now that person or that child's family has to step in. Do they have the means or the resources to be able to do so, right? So this occurs every day, folks. And as that tends to occur, then you have the parents that are incarcerated, right, whether legitimate or not, right? Because it's not that crime doesn't exist, right? My organization, I personally myself am not an abolitionist. I do believe there is a role for the criminal legal system as we think about public safety. I do believe that there are folks that unfortunately do need to be removed from society, hopefully rehabilitated and reformed. So we're not abolitionists, but what we know is that when folks are sitting in the incarceral system, you no longer have that support network for that child. And depending on the resources of the family, that starts the trajectory of the child into, i.e., the child welfare system. So you got, again, multiple systems impacting families when the parents are incarcerated. That child's likelihood of success if they're trajected into the child welfare system, the foster care system, and then think about their ability to learn an education in school. All this is happening simultaneously to this one child. So that creates that separation. It also creates the harm, especially if there's no resources to help rehabilitate or stabilize that family or stabilize that child. That's the most immediate impact. And this is happening in communities everywhere in the state of Colorado and also across the country. In our organization, the second part of our mission to advance community health and safety, we look at how do you reinvest back into communities to help repair and rebuild this harm that's been caused. It's almost looking at it for folks in the room and folks online, if you really think about historically what we've been able to do to repair, restructure, reconstruct, we look at it similar to what we call like the Marshall Plan meeting reparations, right? If we know post-World War II, we went in and rebuilt part of Europe because of the devastation of the war. Well, we're dealing in our country and in our state, the devastation of the criminal legal system on communities. So we implore a strategy called community reinvestment. I mentioned earlier, a lot of our work on a day-to-day basis is working on policy and legislation that we've helped pass over about 85 pieces of criminal justice reform legislation. In that legislation, this particular strategy, we help identify, working in tandem with the systems, we help identify cost savings. Anytime you decrease a prison population, decrease a jail population, decrease supervision of human beings, you have cost savings because these things cost. Currently, right now, our Department of Corrections budget is over $1 billion. $1 billion we are investing in prisons. So to your earlier point of the question around the trade-off of not funding K through 12 or higher education, it boils down to our leadership and our state's priorities. What do we prioritize? How our investments look. And please keep in mind, these are taxpayer dollars. This is our money that we're talking about, our values aligning with the priorities of the state's leadership. And for 2+ decades or more, the priority has been incarceration, building more prisons, building and metastasizing or feeding the criminal legal system. Without going on down that tangent, I hope that I didn't, but to the point being, our organization identified and examined that and said, okay, how can we help? Literally, how can we help? Not being adversarial. How can we help reframe and shape how our state does investment and what the priorities are of our tax dollars? So we created the community reinvestment strategy. Through reforms, there's cost savings, and we work with a very important organization, if you have not heard of them, the Latino Coalition for Community Leadership, serves as an intermediary model. It came out of California. A group of Latino pastors came together when California was downsizing their system and identified that there's funding that wasn't getting into the communities that most needed it. They formed an intermediary model that helps get that funding deeply into community, which is part of the architect and design of our community reinvestment strategy. We had those cost savings. We work with the Latino Coalition for Community Leadership to identify in community what the needs are. And we make sure that that funding is deeply invested into those communities. The beauty of this particular strategy and model, Tina, is that the communities themselves set their priorities. It is community-led. They set their crime prevention priorities. They set their school programming priorities. They set their priorities of what they think the community needs to promote public health and safety. And so we have been deploying that strategy since about 2014. We've had 4 initiatives now that have focused on the cost savings. That's i.e. my mentioning earlier of the $80 million that's been invested in community. That's this strategy with the true goal to repair the harm that has been caused by the criminal legal system. Those 4 particular community reinvestment strategies, and I'll stop here, is one, in 2014, we created the first ever, in conjunction with the Department of Corrections and our state leadership, reentry program for people coming out of prison. That's community-based, community-ran, and not literally service provided by the legal system itself. Year to date, there's over 30 organizations across the state being led doing community reentry. The state's leadership over the last couple of years has continued to invest because the outcomes have been phenomenal in reducing recidivism. The majority of these organizations are led by people who have been formerly incarcerated or directly impacted. And for the first time in the history of our state, working directly in tandem with the Department of Corrections. Formerly incarcerated people who spent time in our prisons, are now running reentry programs in the state in conjunction with our prison system. Never done before. We also created a second one called Transforming Safety. And this one was this particular model was place-based. We looked at communities in the state that were dealing with high volumes of crime, high volumes of victimization, identified North Aurora, Southeast Colorado Springs. This is our place-based model. We worked on some reforms that had investment into both of these areas with 2 tracks. Grant programming for community organizations serving the community, and an entrepreneurial track of funding that help people get back on their feet who are dealing with the collateral consequences of a record and can't get jobs, but have the skill set and competency to create their own businesses and small businesses. These are the strategies, folks, that actually promote public health and safety. A third one I'll mention, and I'll stop there, is we created the first ever Community Crime Victim Services Program, where it stood up 4 brand new entities in our state to serve survivors of crime. And what's intentional about it is it's community ran by people who are survivors of crime themselves. The idea that people often don't receive services, therapeutic services, trauma services, because they didn't report the victimization. It could have happened 20 years ago, but they're still dealing with the trauma. So we were really intentional about, regardless if you reported the victimization, you still need services. You still need help, regardless of the point in time that the victimization occurred, 20 years ago or yesterday. So this new program stood up 4 organizations, and I'll highlight one of the organizations is the first of its kind in the country. It's called the Therapists of Color, Elements of Discovery. It's a cohort of over 30 therapists of color offering 20 free sessions to people who self-identify as being victimized by crime. First of its kind in the country. Because when we're talking about these issues in community, we're talking about communities that have been marginalized. We're talking about communities of color. We're talking about Black and brown folks who have been at literally the bottom of the barrel of the impact of this. And so there was not anything in the country that was very specific to serving people of color who the data says they are the most victimized than any other ethnicity in the country, but yet receive the least services. So that's one other example of our community reinvestment strategy. We kind of got a little bit of a blueprint. Our legs were stumbling. We wasn't like super sophisticated when we created this. We stumbled upon it. But we also knew at the core that reparations meeting Marshall Plan was very important in how do you rebuild these communities. And so we developed this particular strategy, and we're going on the 5th year of looking at another one, but the state leadership has supported it, and it's been very effective.
That's phenomenal. Thank you. That's wonderful. And the whole time I was picturing that child who has been destabilized by having a parent go to prison. Mm-hmm. And so everything you're talking about then stabilizes families, stabilizes children, and instead of the legal system creating and the prison system creating kind of its own future clientele, right, you're stabilizing children so that they have a better chance for a happier future.
Absolutely. And that's the prevention theory. Yeah. People often say, well, how do we prevent this stuff from happening? Right? And prevention is very difficult to measure, right? Because it's preemptive, right? And it's very difficult to fund because how do you know that it works? Yeah. Well, this is how we need to be thinking about smart investment of our taxpayer dollars, because being able to repair the harm and rebuild is a preventative strategy. It decreases the likelihood of that child being incarcerated like their parents, because there's a telltale there, right? There's a cycle there, and that's what we're trying to break.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have one more question for you, and then I want to open up to both our in-person and our online audience. If you are online and you have a question, you can input it in the comments on Facebook or the comments on YouTube, and we have a mechanism that hopefully will work to get that question then to me. And folks here in the cathedral, if you have a question, if you just raise your hand, Jenny here has a handheld mic and we'll bring it to you. Please do wait until you get the mic before you ask that question so everyone can hear you, including our online folks. But before that, I did want to ask and emphasize, we've hit on it, but I wanted to emphasize that CCJRC is exceptional, although maybe not from some of what you've told us this morning, that everyone on your staff has been directly impacted by the criminal legal system, either by being formerly incarcerated or by being victimized, or probably both in many, many cases. So you intentionally work and serve on every side, as you've told us. And is there anything else that you'd like to say about how that sort of informs your work, that you're working from every perspective?
Absolutely. Well, we don't believe in the binary, right? Even folks who are currently incarcerated, there's, a lot of data out there, bodies of research that illustrate that often when people are incarcerated, at some point in time, they were the victims of a crime. They have been victimized as well. And so we work in the intersection of the both and, right? And that is, people absolutely need to be held accountable, right, for their behaviors, especially if it caused harm in community. And at the same time, what happened to them to have them do that? And are they getting adequately served in the help that they need? And so a lot of our work is bipartisan. We work across the aisle when it comes to the policy and politics. When it comes to the people, it's also not binary for us. And so all of our initiatives, our campaigns, again, we don't do direct services per se, but all of our initiatives and campaign, we take a very holistic approach, right, to looking at how can we help work on policy and legislation that's smart, that's common sense, that actually promotes public health and safety, and also that holds people accountable. Right, we're an organization that any initiative that we run, we have several. We have one called Take Care Health Matters. That's a campaign that's ran by my colleague Terry Hurst, where we look at the intersectionality of justice-involved people and access to health care. Right? We have another campaign, our civic engagement campaign, making sure justice-involved people actually have access to engage civically and vote. Because contrary to popular belief in our state, a criminal record does not bar you from voting in the state of Colorado. Right, and that's often unknown, right? So we're still dealing with the civic engagement aspect of justice-involved people is another of our campaigns. Our community reinvestment strategy is another one of our campaigns. So when you look at our campaigns, the idea of what we promote is how do we look at actual safety that works? What works? What can we do different? Regardless of ethnicity, regardless of background, regardless of which side of the fence a person may stand on, regardless if they are the defendant, right, or the perpetrator. Because at some point in time, these folks re-enter back into our communities. They come home, right? So we are starkly aware of that. And we work, a lot of our policy work and our campaigns are comprehensive and examined from that way, because us as staff and board, we've sat at that intersectionality. As a young person, I was in the criminal legal system, but I also have a master's now. So we sit at the intersectionality. I'm raising 2 kids, right? And so it's like all of our staff, we have this intersectionality with this kind of comprehensive approach, because we know that, again, people are not the problem. They have problems. And so that's how we approach our work. We approach our work from an equity lens. All of our work that we do is from an equity lens. And we say, okay, what can we do? How do we do different? Because what we have done has not worked. Right. We have not been able to arrest our way out of substance abuse and mental health. Right. We have not been able to incarcerate our way out of homelessness, right? This dominant response, trillions of dollars spent throughout our country for multiple decades, and yet we're still at a crisis. Yeah. We're still facing the same fear-mongering rhetoric that says crime is going up, we need a dominant criminal legal response. Right. But the health and vitality and quality of life of our communities is continuing to deteriorate. So it's obvious to us as a society that this dominant response cannot be the only response to evolve us out of the crisis that we face. And it impacts all of us, Tina, regardless of our socioeconomic background, regardless of our ethnicity. An example of that, our investment in prisons, decreased funding and investment in higher ed in our state, in Colorado right now, drives up tuition costs for universities. So universities then privatize because they're not getting the funding from the general fund to supplement. And then your child that you're sending to college all of a sudden is paying astronomical costs for tuition. That's the trade-off. It impacts all of us as taxpayers, right? It's not seclusive or exclusive to one ethnicity or race or one socioeconomic class of people. There is a unilateral impact, and that's why your passage is so important about our care for each other, because we're all impacted by this, and that's how CCJRC approaches the work. All of us are responsible for the public health and safety of our communities.
Amen. Thank you for that. I think that's a great place to end our conversation and open it up to questions. Please, if you have any questions for Juston, just let us know. And are we able to track our online questions, Jenny? Tony, do we have any? We don't have any. Oh my goodness. John, do you have a question? Jenny?
I do, and I can speak up so that I can be heard.
Well, I think that our online folks won't be able to hear. You can speak up, but I don't know if you can speak up quite that well. So here's Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
And it's interesting because this morning on the first page of the Denver Post is an article about many of us believe that crime is increasing. However, if you read the article in its entirety, it is in fact not. So my question is twofold. Number one, how do we look at the need for accountability? Because I was looking at a blog the other day, and their demand for accountability of what was happening in this particular neighborhood kind of irritated me and scared me that these, like, killed the, it's like, and I was like, no, what are we doing? So I guess the question is, how are we becoming more informed if we don't read the paper, and if we don't how are you letting us know what you're doing?
That is a great question. Thank you so much for that question in reference to, there's an article this morning about crime going up, right? And that narrative being told, and there's a visceral reaction to,
No, you're fine.
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I apologize, I had to cough.
Oh, okay.
I was trying not to interrupt,
to crime
but clearly
going
it didn't
up,
work.
right? And then, we have to get tough on crime. And the question around, from your perspective of reading that article is like, well, is this true, right? When in fact, actually, is crime going up or is it actually going down? And then who's responsible for getting this information out where people can make informed examinations and informed analysis of what actually is happening with crime as it relates to our safety? And I'm so grateful for that question, and how are people informed? Because this is really, really important what he highlighted. It is very, very dangerous what we're watching happen with the propagandizing of crime. It's not to say that there are not anecdotal moments of crime going up. Crime trends, depending on the data and who's telling the story, period, of it going up and going down and going up. But what we find 30, 40 years ago was a very similar rhetoric and narrative. And from that, we got mass incarceration. We literally got reactionary policy that created trillions of dollars invested into a system. And the fundamental question you have to ask yourself is, do you feel any safer? Do you literally feel any safer? So the narrative or the propaganda of crime going up is a very dangerous thing that gets politicized, especially during election years, right? Who's tougher? Who's tougher on crime, right? It gets invested when you backfill police budgets, when you backfill court systems, when you backfill district attorney administrations to crack down without the real analysis of what do we mean that crime is going up. So where do we get that information? What is my organization doing about that? I'm so glad you asked that question outside of reading it in a newspaper. Well, one, I think as tax-paying citizens who these elected officials are accountable to us, we demand it. We demand it to be posted on their websites. We demand these criminal legal systems to post it on their websites and their annual reports. We demand that our local law enforcement is transparent on the information of crime and pushing that out to the public. As constituents, we should have access to that. We demand that our executive branch push that information out. Our judicial branch, we demand the information. That's one, how we get it. My organization is working tirelessly on figuring out how to counter this narrative. To be honest with you, with us being such a small organization, we don't have a robust communication system. So we're in the process of working on that. But we often put out memos, we often put out op-eds, we often put out information documents, issue memos to try to inform as many people as possible on what the data actually says, what's actually accurate. Currently, right now, we have maybe about 7,000 members across the state for CCJRC. 2,000 of our members are currently incarcerated in prison. But we often, advance a lot of our messaging to our members in media. We're working diligently to try to counter this very dangerous narrative that's happening right now. And I can tell you first and foremost, with us, our membership, we don't have dues or anything like that. We say, hey, look, sign up, newsletter, go to our website. We'll get as much information to you as possible, right? We do believe in the accuracy and the truth of the information. Crime is going up. That's very true. It is very real. And what is our response? And it's happening in pockets. And it's anecdotal. And the data show that it's going to trend down. So when we think about crime is going up, that's true. What we hear in media is, and I don't know if I can say this in the, this is what they say in the media. I hope this is,
I think that's fine.
they talk about people who are rapists or murderers, and that is the fear mongering that's like, oh my God, right? We have violent crime. It's very real, these things that occur. We see it in the media, we've seen it in our lives. But the question is, how accurate is the information? Who's telling the story? Who's telling the alternatives to it, right? We know that we're dealing with an opioid epidemic. We know that we're dealing with a current fentanyl epidemic. Very scary stuff, very real. People are losing lives. The question is, how are we responding as a state?
Right.
And if we get tough, we have a proven history that we cannot arrest our way out of it. We cannot incarcerate our way out of it, right? We can't supervise our way out of it. So the question is, what's the alternative? So our organization is pushing that information out as much as we can. The advocacy community is a shared community. We're not the only ones. There's, really organizations that work really hard. I don't know about folks' political stances, but there's the ACLU of Colorado, Colorado Criminal Defense Bar, Colorado Immigrants' Rights Coalition. There's a lot of other activists and advocacy organizations that are pushing hard to get real information out, accurate information out, that allows you as a tax-paying citizen and a voter to choose. Both sides of the story, right? But be very careful, because what we're doing right now is very, very, very dangerous, ladies and gentlemen. And who's telling the story, regardless of their political ideology, their religious ideology, the folks who tell the story, who write the narrative, tend to shape our public policy response. And it's knee-jerk, it's reactive, right? We've seen that with the school-to-prison pipeline, right? When there was the unfortunate incident of Columbine, and there's other school shootings that have occurred, and the idea was, we gotta protect. Yes, we do. We gotta promote accountability, absolutely. We have to have a legal system that has the ability to make sure that accountability is there. But the also responsibility of the criminal legal system is to serve and protect. We have lost sight of the service side of this system. And the community, our public health system, our education system, our housing system in our state are service sides of safety. And that's where we got to get to the accountability. That's the information we got to put out there. We're working diligently. We need help. And the last thing I'll say to your question is, how do we get accurate information, or how do we get this information? We question what we read. Yeah. Question it. Really say, okay, who's the author? Who's writing this? What is their position? Are they an elected official? Or are they a former elected official? Right? Often a lot of what's happening in the Denver Post right now, a lot of the articles that you're seeing on Tough on Crime is written by a former elected district attorney. So his vision, his crystal glasses are going to be from that lens. A surgeon operates from a surgical lens. A district attorney operates from a criminal punishment lens. So you'll hear these stories. Question who the author is. Where's the information coming from? Why is it in the Denver Post? Why is it front page? Why? How are we not talking about the housing crisis that we're faced with in Denver? The food desert that we're faced with in Denver? The impact of COVID that rolled back 30 years of this tough on crime rhetoric when COVID inadvertently had the system reform itself. They had to decrease jails. They had to decrease supervision because of contact. And guess what? Crime didn't go up. So when you're seeing in the paper, oh, reform is the reason why crime is going up. We're letting all these bad people out of prison. We're letting them out of jail. We're not supervising them. They're drug addicts. They're this, that. Interesting. How's that a correlation to crime? And if that is the case, what are we doing about it? Because we're going to rearrest them? If crime's going up, there's a political motivation to this narrative, and it's very dangerous, and I appreciate your question.
Thank you so much. I could keep talking
Sorry,
to you, but we
I
are
tend
out
to
of time.
ramble.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. We are out of time, but thank you so much for being here, Juston. Thank you all for being
Thank
here. Today is the final of 3 weeks, following up from a conversation that Richard had last year with Dr. Catherine Meeks about racial healing. And so if you have not had a chance, I encourage you to go to our YouTube page and listen to Richard's conversations with Canon Stephanie Spellers and last week's conversation with Representative Leslie Herod. And thank you so much for finishing us
Tina,
off today,
for
Juston.
having
Thanks
me.
for being here. Please join us at 10:30 for our service of Choral Eucharist. And we will not have a Dean's Forum next week, but please join us for the annual meeting.